We looked at creating an exhibition called 14 as a sort of homage to 1914, but we then selected 14 artists and makers and pretty much gave them free rein in terms of an open-ended response, and everyone has approached it in a very, very different way, and some being very reflective of their normal practice, some taking an opportunity to go off in different areas, and some makers and artists have used it as an opportunity to explore their own family history. So Becky Adams, a textile artist, she is known for her work being sort of autobiographical and referencing her own sort of family history, and so she used it as an opportunity to explore areas that she hadn't before, and discovered all sorts of interesting things about her history. Medals that had been won by relatives that had died, relatives that had survived, and so she created a piece sort of in reference to that. And then Anne Gibbs, ceramicist, went off on a completely different tangent and became fascinated by some of the objects that she discovered during her research, and in particular things like observation balloons and barrage balloons, which are not the normal things that you would think of in terms of conflict. It tends to be barbed wire or mud or guns or whatever, but it was actually these tools of finding out what was going on, in a sense, in those fields. It's a very sort of different approach. And then John Selway, as a painter, he was looking at the Angel of Mons, the story that's almost sort of gone into mythology. And there have been authors, Arthur Machen, who's purported to have created the story, actually publicly saying that it was an invention, that it was a myth, but actually then people disputing and arguing that it was actually, that the myth he created was in fact reality. And that whole story is now seeped into our wider consciousness in terms of the Angel of Mons being the saviour of British forces, and yet it's the question: was it invented or was it real? And so that's sort of something that John has been exploring. I think particularly also because Arthur Machen is from this area, so again there's that sort of notion of linking back into a literature side. So it's been interesting how each of the 14 have approached the concept and the idea of the exhibition in very, very different ways, and used it to explore things in their own families or their own practice which really didn't have an opportunity to perform. So it's been a very interesting process, and like I said, the resulting work, and just in terms of its scale, sort of Becky Adams producing pieces this sort of size. Anne Gibbs's work is quite small. Ruth Harry's, again another textile artist, producing work which she's called the Red Cross series, so very much exploring the themes of a woman's role in the conflict, and how that in and amongst the carnage then there were people whose role was to act as saviours in a sense. But her work, again, very small in scale. And then Alice Kettle producing this 6 metres by 1.5 metres, so a colossal piece of work. So it's going to be an interesting process. But when we started to unpack the work, and we've got Alice's piece, so it very much dictates where that's going to go. And then we were looking at an installation piece that Roseanne Hawksley has sent us, which is using sort of 13 sort of crucifixes as the motif. And then Stephen West, who's produced a sculptural piece which looks very totemic, very much like an altarpiece. So we've looked at the gallery space, our main gallery, which has a sort of bay window at one end. And when sort of laying out the box, it started to take on almost a sort of sense of a religious space, looked very church-like, and I think that's sort of reflected in the sort of reverence that we've held this exhibition. It's very much about what we wanted was a show that was very respectful, and that because we were all of us, both staff and artists exhibiting, became aware during the putting of this exhibition together that our lives have been shaped by events that happened 100 years ago, and that in some instances our existence or our children's existence is dependent on somebody sort of being killed 100 years ago, and that the world in which we live has been shaped by political events which have their roots in the conflict. So the world in which we live, even though it was 100 years away, technologically a million miles away from where we were in 1914, our existence has been shaped by those events of a century ago. And I think that this exhibition and other exhibitions around Wales and the UK, which are giving an opportunity to reflect on what that's meant for society as a whole. And I think it's a very poignant time, and I hope that people take the opportunity to reflect in a sense. I think that to have an exhibition like this here in Torline, I think is important, because the people look at look at the county. It's very small. It's 9 miles by 4. You have a modern town, Cwmbran, where we're based. At one end, you have Pontypool and Llantarnam. At the moment, the fortunes are that Cwmbran is prosperous and is thriving. Pontypool is struggling and is going through an area of redevelopment. And Llantarnam is a town which is very much tied into its past, but in its industrial past. And so the fortunes have changed. Was 100 years ago, Llantarnam was the powerhouse. Steelworks, ironworks, coal mining. It was the epicentre of industry. That was funneled through Pontypool, whose marshalling yards were the biggest in Europe. The coal coming through there was powering the industry, powered the Industrial Revolution, and it's powered everything to do with the war in terms of boats and ships and trains, and kept the fires going. Whereas Cwmbran at that time was a little sort of like collection of small rural villages. The building we're in sat in amongst a sort of walled garden where the shopping centre now is. So I think that Torline, in a sense, reflects how over 100 years the economy can be turned on its head. How, in a sense, the population changes. Where in Pontypool and Llantarnam there are families who can trace their roots all the way back to 1914 and beyond. Whereas here in Cwmbran, only a handful of families can do that, because it's a very different place. But then, post-Second World War, areas were created, new towns were created, and Cwmbran is Wales's new town, to sort of become a home for heroes, in a sense, to a place that could feed the new industries out of Syrian white heated technology. And it was a place that became a sort of buzzword for modernism, in a sense. And I think that it's important that people can see and reflect how society has changed, and how attitudes have changed, and how their own families have changed over time. And I think that throughout the area there will be exhibitions at Pontypool Museum, great archives are holding sort of exhibitions, very much looking at sort of documents and objects from the past. And what we felt we could add was a debate about contemporary practice, and how, as individuals living in the now, we can reflect and think back on the past, and and what meaning it has for us now, 100 years on, and what meaning we can carry forward into the future. So I think that balance between a reflective object and social historical side and a contemporary interpretation, I think, is a nice mix, and I think it gives a nice rounded experience.